Imagine a fire. When an ordinary man is wronged, a raging, violent fire ignites in his chest. It is loud, it is blinding, and it consumes everything in its path. He screams, he strikes out, he demands immediate justice. But this kind of anger is the weapon of fools and the weak, because a fire, no matter how bright, eventually burns itself out, leaving behind nothing but cold, useless ash. Now, imagine a glacier. It is silent. It is devoid of light. It takes years, sometimes decades, to form in the freezing absolute darkness. It moves so slowly that the naked eye cannot even perceive its motion. But when it finally arrives, it crushes mountains. It flattens forests. It erases entire landscapes from the face of the earth, and there is absolutely nothing in the world that can stop it. Real absolute power is never hot. It is freezing cold. Welcome to the anatomy of the perfect revenge. Today, we are not reading a novel by Alexandre Dumas. We are stepping into the terrifying, blood-soaked, and entirely real history that inspired the greatest tale of vengeance ever told, the Count of Monte Cristo. Turn off the lights. Let the shadows crawl up the walls. Listen to the meticulous, chilling mathematics of a mind that lost everything, only to rebuild itself as a god of retribution. This is the epic of Pierre Picaud. This is the mathematics of revenge. Part I, The Banquet of Envy. The year is 1807. The cobblestone streets of Paris are bustling with the intoxicating energy of Napoleon's empire. In a modest but thriving neighborhood, there lived a man who had committed the greatest, most unforgivable sin a human being can commit in the eyes of society. He was perfectly, undeniably happy. His name was Pierre Picaud. He was a young, handsome, and remarkably talented shoemaker. Wealth was just beginning to flow into his pockets, but his true treasure was his fiancée, Marguerite. She was breathtakingly beautiful, born into a wealthy family, and she loved Pierre with a pure, unyielding devotion. In just a few days, they were to be married. Pierre had the world resting gently in the palms of his hands. But human nature is a dark, festering swamp. There is a specific kind of poison that breeds in the hearts of men when they are forced to look at someone else's flawless happiness. That poison is envy. On a rainy Tuesday evening, in a dimly lit, smoke-filled tavern, three men sat around a wooden table drinking cheap wine. The owner of the tavern was Mathieu Lupien. Lupien was a bitter, deeply insecure man who had secretly lusted after Marguerite for years, only to be rejected. Sitting next to him were Solari and Chaubart, two men who despised Pierre simply because his life was ascending while theirs were rotting in the gutters. A fourth man, Antoine Alout, sat in the corner, quietly drinking, watching the venom drip from their lips. As they watched Pierre walk past the tavern window, laughing in the rain, the black mold in Lupien's heart finally overtook his sanity. "Why him?" Lupien whispered, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure malice. "Why should a peasant shoemaker have the gold, the girl, and the glory?" Lupien took a piece of parchment and a quill. Driven by nothing but the pathetic, burning agony of jealousy, he drafted a letter to the imperial police. The letter claimed that Pierre Picaud was a highly dangerous English spy, plotting to fund a royalist uprising against Emperor Napoleon. It was a complete, fabricated lie, an absurd joke born of wine and spite. Alout, the silent man in the corner, warned them, "Do not send that. It is a wicked, cowardly thing." But Lupien just laughed, a cruel, drunken sound, and dropped the letter into the mail. They thought they were merely playing a prank. They thought they would ruin his wedding day, perhaps have him locked up for a week to teach him a lesson. They had absolutely no idea that with that single drop of ink, they had just signed their own brutal, unavoidable death warrants. Part 2. The Tomb of the Living. On the very day of his wedding, as Pierre stood in his immaculate suit, waiting for the doors of the church to open, the heavy, iron-clad boots of the Imperial Guard echoed through the square. Without a single word of explanation, without a trial, without a judge, a black sack was thrown over his head. He was dragged away from the sunlight, away from his beautiful Marguerite, away from his entire existence. Pierre was thrown into the Finestrelle fortress, a massive, horrific stone labyrinth carved into the freezing Alps. It was a place where political prisoners were sent not to be punished, but to be erased. He was cast into a subterranean dungeon where no sunlight had touched the stone for centuries. The heavy iron door slammed shut, echoing like the final heartbeat of a dying man. For the first few years, Pierre was consumed by the fire of anger. He screamed until his throat bled. He tore at the heavy iron chains until his fingernails ripped from his flesh. He begged God for mercy. He begged the guards for an explanation. Why was he here? What had he done? But the stone walls offered no answers. The fire in his chest burned with an agonizing heat, driving him to the absolute brink of insanity. But as the years crawled by in that absolute, suffocating darkness, a terrifying transformation occurred. The fire inside Pierre Picaud began to die, and in its place, the glacier began to form. He stopped screaming. He stopped crying. He sat in the pitch-black dampness, his mind sharpening into a razor's edge. He began to calculate. He realized that this was not a mistake. This was the deliberate, malicious work of someone he knew. In the 7th year of his entombment, a miracle born of the shadows took place. He discovered a hidden passageway connected to the cell of an Italian cleric, Father Torri. The priest was immensely wealthy, a political prisoner who had hidden a vast, unimaginable treasure in Milan before his arrest. For the next several months, the priest became Pierre's mentor, teaching him languages, sciences, and the dark, intricate philosophies of power. When the priest died in the dampness of the cell, he bequeathed his entire colossal fortune to Pierre. In 1814, Emperor Napoleon fell from power. The political prisoners were released. The heavy iron doors of Fenestrelle finally groaned open. A man walked out into the blinding alpine sunlight. But it was not Pierre Picaud. Pierre the shoemaker had died in that dungeon. The man who walked out was a phantom. His hair had turned bone white. His face was a hardened, emotionless mask of stone. His body was gaunt, but his eyes burned with a cold, terrifying, abyssal intelligence. He was no longer a victim. He was an architect of doom. Part 3. The Resurrection and the Diamond. The phantom traveled to Milan. He unearthed Father Torri's hidden treasure, heavy chests overflowing with flawless diamonds, ancient gold coins, and priceless jewels. In a single day, the penniless, forgotten prisoner became one of the wealthiest men in Europe. An ordinary man would have taken that gold and fled to a tropical island to live out his days in luxury. But the phantom did not care about luxury. The gold was not wealth to him. It was ammunition. It was the capital required to fund his mathematical equation of vengeance. He spent the next year transforming himself. He adopted multiple identities, using his immense wealth to purchase influence, documents, and loyalty. Finally, disguised as an Italian priest named Abbé Baldini, he returned to France. He needed the variables for his equation. He needed names. His investigation led him to Antoine Alout, the fourth man from the tavern, the one who had watched the betrayal but did nothing. The phantom, dressed in his clerical robes, found Alout living in poverty in a small village. He sat across from Alout and placed a massive, flawless diamond on the wooden table. It sparkled with a hypnotic, intoxicating light. "I am here, on behalf of a dying man named Pierre Picaud." The phantom lied flawlessly. He asked me to give this diamond to the man who can tell me the truth about why he was imprisoned. Alout stared at the diamond. His greed instantly overpowered his morality. He spilled every single detail. He named Lupien. He named Solari. He named Chobart. He described the laughter in the tavern, the ink on the parchment, the sheer pathetic jealousy that had condemned an innocent man to hell. The phantom listened without blinking. His heart rate did not elevate. He nodded slowly, handed the diamond to Alout, and walked out into the rain. The equation was now complete. The variables were known. It was time for the mathematics of revenge to begin. Part IV, Equation 1 and 2, the blood of the followers. The phantom knew that killing his betrayers quickly would be an act of mercy. A bullet to the head is a blessing. It ends the pain in a fraction of a second. True vengeance is not about taking a life. It is about taking a reality. It is about making the betrayer watch as every single pillar of their existence is systematically pulverized into dust. He started with the followers. Chobart, the first conspirator, had built a comfortable, quiet life. One foggy evening, as he was walking across the Pont des Arts bridge in Paris, a shadow detached itself from the thick mist. There was no conversation. There was no dramatic villain's monologue. A blade, cold and precise, slipped flawlessly into Schobart's heart. When the police found his body the next morning, they discovered a small, blood-soaked piece of parchment pinned to his chest with the dagger. Written in immaculate, elegant handwriting were the words, "Number 1. Panic began to ripple through the remaining conspirators. Solari, the second betrayer, heard the news and was paralyzed with a terrifying, nameless dread. But paranoia cannot save you from a ghost. A few weeks later, Solari attended a lavish dinner party. He ate, he drank, he tried to laugh away the fear gripping his spine. But the phantom had already used his limitless wealth to infiltrate the kitchen. A slow-acting, agonizing, and entirely undetectable poison had been slipped into Solari's wine. For 3 days, Solari writhed in his bed in unimaginable, shrieking agony. His organs slowly failed, burning from the inside out. When he finally drew his last tortured breath, the undertaker came to prepare his body. As the wooden lid of the coffin was lowered, the mourners gasped in horror. Pinned to the velvet lining of the casket was a pristine white card bearing the words, "Number 2. The glacier was moving. It was silent. It was inevitable, and it was now casting a massive, suffocating shadow over the architect of the betrayal, Mathieu Lupien." Part V. Equation 3. The annihilation of Lupien. Lupien had flourished. While Pierre was rotting in the dark, Lupien had stolen his life. He had manipulated the grieving Marguerite into marrying him. He had taken Pierre's business, built a highly successful restaurant in the center of Paris, and raised a beautiful daughter and a son. He had everything, which meant he had everything to lose. The phantom, now disguised as a charming, wealthy gentleman named Joseph Lucher, did not attack Lupien with a knife. He attacked him with mathematics. First, the financial pillar. One night, a mysterious fire broke out in Lupien's famous restaurant. The flames were relentless, burning the establishment down to its very foundations. Lupien was financially ruined overnight. He was forced to borrow massive sums of money to survive, money secretly provided by the phantom through proxy bankers at exorbitant, crushing interest rates. Lupien was now a slave to debt. Second, the psychological pillar. Lupien had a beautiful, innocent daughter whom he worshipped. The phantom introduced her to a dashing, incredibly wealthy aristocrat, a marquis. The marquis swept the girl off her feet. A lavish, magnificent wedding was arranged. Lupien felt a glimmer of hope. His daughter's wealthy marriage would save the family from poverty. But on the night of the wedding, as the elite of Paris raised their glasses, the doors of the banquet hall were violently kicked open by the police. The marquis was exposed not as an aristocrat, but as an escaped, violent convict, an actor secretly hired and funded by the phantom. The public humiliation was absolute. The scandal destroyed the family's name. The daughter, unable to bear the colossal shame and heartbreak, lost her mind and died of a broken spirit shortly after. Marguerite, witnessing the utter destruction of her family, succumbed to grief and died of a failing heart. Third, the final pillar, Lupien's son. The phantom befriended the young, impressionable boy. He slowly introduced him to a world of gambling, debt, and vice. When the boy was desperate for money, the phantom convinced him to participate in a victimless burglary. It was a trap. The police were waiting. Lupien's son was arrested in chains and sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in a brutal penal colony. Mathieu Lupien was now an empty shell. He had no money. He had no wife. He had no daughter. He had no son. He was a beggar wandering the dark, wet streets of Paris, his mind completely broken by the relentless, invisible hammer blows of fate. On a freezing, rain-swept night, Lupien was walking through a dark alley. A tall figure in a heavy black coat stepped out from the shadows. The phantom walked slowly toward the broken man. He removed his hat. He stepped into the dim light of a street lamp. Lupien stared at the bone-white hair, the cold, abyssal eyes, and suddenly, through the mists of time and madness, he recognized him, the shoemaker, the man he had sent to hell. "You," Lupien whispered, falling to his knees in the mud. "Pierre." Pierre Picaud did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply looked down at the pathetic, weeping creature before him. With the chilling, emotionless precision of a surgeon, Pierre drew a dagger and drove it directly into Lupien's heart. As Lupien gasped his final breath, Pierre leaned down and whispered into his ear. Number 3. The equation was solved. The mathematics were flawless. The revenge was absolute. Part Vi, the final variable. But if you open your ledger, you will realize that human nature is an infinitely complex equation, and Pierre Picaud, for all his godlike intelligence, failed to calculate the final variable. He forgot about Antoine Alout, the man he had given the diamond to. Alout had sold the diamond, but his greed was a bottomless pit. He had secretly followed Pierre. He had watched the murders. He had deduced the identity of the phantom. After Lupien's body hit the mud, as Pierre turned to walk away into the shadows, a heavy iron bar struck him from behind. Pierre woke up chained to a stone wall in a dark, damp cellar. Antoine Alout stood before him, holding a knife. Alout did not care about justice. He did not care about Lupien or the others. He only cared about the Italian priest's gold. "Tell me where the rest of the treasure is," Alout demanded. "Give me the gold and I will let you live." Pierre Picaud looked at his captor. He was back in chains. He was back in the dark, but the glacier in his mind did not melt. The phantom simply looked at Alout with those cold, dead eyes and refused to speak. For days, Alout tortured him. He starved him. But Pierre had spent 7 years in Fenestrelle. He had already mastered pain. He had already conquered death. He uttered not a single word. Frustrated, enraged, and terrified of the monster he held captive, Alout finally drove his knife into Pierre's chest, killing the architect of the greatest revenge in history. Alout fled to England, living in paranoid terror until the day he died. On his deathbed, consumed by guilt and fear, he confessed the entire horrifying saga to a Catholic priest. That priest wrote it down. The records found their way to the French police archives, and eventually onto the desk of a writer named Alexandre Dumas, who would sanitize the brutal, unforgiving truth into the romanticized novel we know today as The Count of Monte Cristo. Part V. The Brutal Ledger of Strategy. As you listen to the tragic silence that follows the death of Pierre Picaud, a terrifying realization should be creeping into your mind. We all love the fantasy of revenge. When someone betrays us, when someone steals our credit at work, when a partner breaks our trust, our blood boils. We want them to suffer. We want to see them ruined. But close the novels, put away the Hollywood movies, and look at the cold mathematical reality of the ledger. Pierre Picaud executed the most flawless, mathematically perfect strategy of destruction ever conceived. He mastered patience. He controlled his emotions. He struck his enemies where they were most vulnerable, rather than where they were strongest. He used their own greed, their own lust, their own families against them. But what was the final balance of his ledger? He spent 7 years in a physical prison and another 10 years in a psychological one. He dedicated his immense wealth, his brilliant mind, and every single second of his breathing existence to the destruction of pathetic, worthless men. In annihilating them, he annihilated himself. He became the very darkness that had consumed him. And in the end, he was murdered in a dirty cellar by a greedy coward. His massive fortune left rotting in the shadows. Here is the ultimate brutal truth about revenge. It is the most expensive luxury in the human experience. If you are dedicating your energy to destroying those who wronged you, you are still allowing them to dictate the trajectory of your life. You are letting the people you hate act as the CEO of your mind. True power, ultimate strategy, is not about punishing the Lupiens of the world. It is about rendering them utterly irrelevant. When you escape your own fenestrelle, whether that is a toxic workplace, a shattered relationship, or a massive financial failure, take the treasure you find and build an empire of your own. Do not waste your gold buying daggers for peasants. Vengeance is a mathematical equation where the final result is always 0. The only true revenge is massive, untouchable, and indifferent success. The ledger is closed.